This is a black walnut tree. I planted it 25 years ago, realizing that I would not be alive when it was ready to be harvested. But I wanted to leave a legacy, perhaps, of a bunch of good, straight-grained black walnut for those who came after me. The circular from the Cornell Forestry said that walnuts liked a free-draining, moist soil. They also said they should be planted about 12 to 15 feet apart. This area here is the peripheral area to where the glacier went down the Hudson River Valley. And along the sides there were a lot of streams trapped between the hill and the glacier. They carried a lot of sand. So this whole field area here is pretty sandy. And this is a little bit of a low spot, so it should have the moisture that these things wanted. So this is where I chose to do my initial planting. Each year I got 25 seedlings from the local nursery. When I first went there, they advised me to plant them with a surrounding of Russian olive. It turns out the Russian olive has these inch to inch and a half long thorns and forms a thick, fast-growing thicket that deters the deer from getting to the walnut seedling and eating its buds. The autumn olive grew so quickly, however, that I found that I kept having to trim it so that the walnut could get any sunlight at all. But it did do an excellent job of keeping the deer away from the young seedlings. In addition, the growth sort of deprived the walnut of light for its lower branches, forcing it to grow straight and tall. So it was really a very good plant to use with the black walnut. Here you can see an example of one of the nasty sharp thorns that the Russian olive has. Punctured one of my mower tires with one of these things on a mature branch. So these are great protection from the deer, but make the whole plant nasty to deal with. Other than that, I thought it was a really great plant. It has very fragrant flowers when it does bloom, and it has a little edible, almost like a cherry, perhaps a 1/4 inch in diameter, and the birds are very fond of it. The flowers themselves give a lot of nectar, and when I had all of the Russian olive growing in my walnut orchard, there were hummingbirds that would come regularly, and at one point I counted 8 of them that were buzzing around enjoying the nectar from the Russian olive. Every year I would purchase 25 walnut seedlings and 100 Russian olive seedlings, and I'd plant them progressively up this way. The 4th year I went and asked for the same order, and they said they wouldn't give me the Russian olive. And I asked, well, why not? And they said, it's been declared an invasive. And I was like, oh no. I came home and looked, and sure enough, it had propagated all along the edge of the woods. All these birds that were enjoying the seed so much would fly over to the edge of the field and drop, and there were probably 100 of these Russian olives in addition to the 300 that I had planted. So I immediately began trying to eradicate them. It took me 2 years just to cut down all of the Russian olive, because they were fast growers, and they were like 3 inches in diameter and multi-pronged, and you have to get them out by the roots. because they regrow very easily from the roots. And I'm still fighting them along the edge of the forest. Part of the problem was they propagated throughout the neighborhood. I actually asked my neighbors, can I come and cut them down? And they were reluctant to, because they loved the smell, they loved the hummingbirds, and they thought the flowers were pretty. So they're pretty much all over the place, and I feel a little bit guilty for having taken a part in introducing an invasive species to the area, but I am trying to get rid of them. I did continue planting walnut trees though, and I've got probably maybe 300 now around these fields. And that brings into question exactly how should you plant them. Well, in a field like this, you've usually got a well-established turf, and that means that you've got all this grass that has its roots out that's fighting desperately to get the water that falls. So one of the things you have to do is you have to eliminate a fair bit of that grass so that the seedling or the seed has a chance to get water without having that sucked off by the roots of the grass. So I consistently made about a 2-foot diameter circle about 3 to 4 inches deep where I removed all of the sod. Initially I thought the way to do that would be to just cut down and take off this big mat of sod, but then I realized I've got this disc of dirt and sod now that is going to be a problem for my mower. So I had to take it and say, okay, let's break it up. I took the shovel and chopped, and it kept moving while I was trying to chop it. So I said, the way to do it is to go ahead and take it into little pieces while you're doing the excavation. And I came up with a method of doing that which really looks unorthodox, but seems to work fairly well. I'll demonstrate it, you can laugh if you wish, but like I said, of all the methods I've tried, I think this works the best. So, the main thing we want to do is get rid of the sod. And once we've cleared out about a 2-foot diameter circle, then we just go into the middle of it. Make a slot. And then if you're dealing with a seedling, which they tend to have fairly long roots, you whip that down in, and then you press in on either side. And that way you're squeezing the soil against the roots and not doing anything to tear the roots. Similarly, if you're planting walnut itself, drop it down in, probably push it down about 6 inches with the shovel, and then seal it. This is a young walnut. It has compound leaves. This one has like 11 leaflets on it, a terminal leaflet, and it's easily confused with its close cousin, the butternut. Also could be confused for hickory and possibly even sumac, but it does tend to have the slightly reddish tinge to the fresh young leaves. One difference between the walnut and the butternut is the butternut almost always has perfectly formed leaves, like this one on the walnut, where it's got matching pairs and then one terminal leaflet on the end. With walnut, it can have a lot of variations out on the end. For instance, on this walnut seedling, You see that out here on the end, this is a deformed leaf where there's the main leaflet, but it's merged with the side leaflet. And in some instances, there's no leaflet at the apex. So you can have mismatched near the tip, and you won't find that typically on butternut, but you will find it on walnut. Walnut is popular with the deer. Here you can see where there were earlier leaves growing out this way, and the deer just nibbled them off, and that's dead now, but it's trying to grow new leaves and leaflets coming from further back on the stem. So it's been put back probably by about a month in its development, and that's pretty much on every sprout on this tree. So you can see how the deer will just really set these things back in their growth. And another problem, you can see the deer will sometimes grab hold of the top to pull it down, and they will break off the growing tip. So a new tip will have to form, and you'll end up with a jog in your lumber, which is not desirable. So the deer are a real problem with the walnuts. Another problem you can see for the walnuts is caterpillars. You've got these holes eaten through the leaves. Sometimes the tent caterpillars can really do a number on them. Here's a caterpillar right here that's busy attacking this leaf. Trying to hide like a walking stick right now. But I try to go around to the trees in the spring, at least the saplings, and dispense with the caterpillars that are on them. There's usually only one per sapling, and just that one can make a huge difference in how many leaflets survive. The squirrels are also very fond of the walnuts themselves. It's not that they eat them, but they just really like to collect them. And they occasionally eat them, but I think it's a lot of work getting through the husk and the shell, and more often than not they tend to plant them with the expectation that they'll go back later and gather them. But every single tree you see in this frame was well, every one of the walnut trees you see in this frame was one that was planted by a squirrel. So they are not very good at remembering where they have buried the walnuts, and many of them end up sprouting. I'm growing these trees ideally for lumber, and one of the things you have to do is try to make sure that the bottom is free from branches so that it can end up having a lot of nice straight grain. And here you can see some of the places where I've cut and removed branches and they have healed over. You have to make sure you're just outside of the growth ring, and then you can get good sealing. But in my zeal to eliminate lower branches, I ended up with a tree that had a lot of tall straight trunk, but then up at the top it had all of its growth, and this doesn't look very thick now, but it's not yet the height of the growth season. And what happened was that with all of the growth being forced to go to the top, we got a windstorm, and that whole thing fell over, got pushed down onto the ground, and ended up getting, over the years, 4 separate good-sized saplings that got blown down. Not broken, but all of their weight down to the side. And in 3 of the 4 cases, I was able to restore them by either propping them up with long sticks, or by putting a string around them with a hose to protect the bark from the string, and then tying that off to a stake on the side so that they were near vertical. And as I said, in 3 of the 4 cases, ended up with nice, straight, recuperated trunks like this one. If walnut is grown in the open, it tends to really spread out. It can get actually wider than it is tall. And if you're trying to grow it for timber, that's really not a good condition because it will start branching before it's really very tall. If you try to grow it where there's restricted light, it has to grow for the light and it tends to shed its lower branches. But it's not shade tolerant, so you can't plant it in the forest and you can't plant it where there's a lot of shade. The ideal conditions for walnut would probably be if you've got a field that you're going to let regrow. And that way it would grow in competition with other trees. There would be light above, but it wouldn't grow laterally because of the other trees. So vegetating a open area would be good conditions for walnut to grow in. One of the big problems with walnuts that are grown in open conditions is the development of co-dominant stems. If you have it branch and these end up both competing and both of them surviving, then you've got a situation where they will continue growing as if they were 2 trunks, and this area in between will gradually have them grow together. You'll have included bark and you'll have a distinct weakness there. And there's a good chance that you'll eventually get a storm that will take one of the 2 and break it along that plane of weakness. And when it goes, it could fall down and it could just rip the bark way down the side. And once the bark is gone, that's really the cambium is where the living part of the tree is, and that will leave a wound that will not heal and will probably be a fatal wound to the tree. So one of the things you need to do if you're starting them in the open is you have to try and prevent the development of co-dominant stems. Once they've started, you have either 2 options. If they're fairly small, you can pick the one that looks better as a growing top and cut off the other one. But in a case like this where you've got a lot of tree growing on both of these, you don't want to have all of the vegetation on that side killed off immediately. So what you can do is what they call subordinating that branch. And what you do is you cut off the top part that's competing for being at the top of the tree, and you cut off perhaps half of the branches. That gives you a situation where that branch is not generating as much food energy as it was before, so this one ends up being the favored one, but this one is still contributing, so it's not as big a shock to the system as if you had just completely cut it off. So you trim it back, and then the next year, or maybe even the year after that, then you can go and finish taking the unfavored co-dominant stem completely off. And you want to try and figure out where the growth collar is, cut just outside of that, and hopefully get it to seal over. Another problem with the co-dominant stems is that they really reduce the amount of the trunk that's suitable for lumber. This eventually may be fairly straight, but this part here is just not usable as lumber. It's got all that distorted grain in there, and as these things grow out to the side, they develop natural stresses to keep them from falling over, and those stresses get locked into the wood, and that's called reaction wood. And if you try to cut a piece of lumber that's cut from reaction wood, those stresses are still locked in, and you can take a piece that looks straight, rip it down the middle, and the 2 pieces will both bend on you. So the reaction wood is not suitable. So that's another strong reason to try to eliminate the codominant stems and get as much branch-free trunk as you can. You remember at the outset I showed you a trunk that was really quite straight and in good condition. All of the walnut trees that I've grown, even starting with seedlings, they start out with a very uneven growth. I mean, here you can see this one had a stem that died, and so it's got all these areas of unevenness to it. And what I'm wondering is, as it adds wood around it, as it grows, almost all of them are eventually ending up like a straight trunk. But what has me wondering is this shape preserved in the grain inside of the tree? Or is it possible that as the tree grows, the outer layers are trying to grow straight and they're exerting some forces, tensile and compression forces, that cause a lot of this to straighten out? Some arborists might be able to tell me what the inside looks like, but I'm hoping there's at least a little bit of that as it grows, it tends to straighten out what's on the inside. Otherwise, on the inside of some of these trees, you could have some really wavy heartwood, and I wouldn't want to see that happen. Initially, when I was cutting off all the lower branches to get nice, tall, straight trunks, I was concerned about what would happen as the tree got taller and it got up to where I wouldn't be able to reach the branches and keep it growing straight up. It turns out that I need not have worried, because once the trees got big enough that their canopies started to connect, they did their own trimming. They wouldn't put any more energy into growing their lower branches that weren't getting enough sunlight. They'd cut them off, let them die, and then they would drop. So all over the orchard I got all of these limbs. Some of them quite large, that just keep falling off of the trees as they self-prune. So they take care of themselves in terms of getting a straight trunk. Each walnut tree has both male and female flowers growing on it. The timing is kind of strange, because for some of the species, the subspecies, varieties of walnut, the male will release its pollen first, and then the females will later be receptive, and in other species it's actually reversed. So within one tree, the chances of self-pollinating are somewhat limited, because there's a mistiming between when the male flowers and the female flowers are trying to do the breeding. When they do succeed, the walnuts will form, and they're usually on the tips of the branches. They're 1.5 to 2 inches in diameter for the large ones, a bright green with a rough husk, almost spherical. There's a sort of a meat on the outside that's quite tough, and then you get to the hard walnut shell, and inside that are the various chambers where the actual meat of the walnut is. The seeds fall off depending on what climate you're in, maybe about August up here, and initially, like I said, they're a fairly bright green, but fairly quickly they'll darken, and then they'll turn black, and the staining ability of that stuff is pretty impressive, and the exterior starts to dissolve somewhat. My guess is that that exterior, if it's planted, forms a protective chemical around the seed, and also provides it some nutrients so it can grow. The roots of the walnut are fairly interesting. As with most trees, they form the primary repository for it's overwintering the storage for its sugars and other nutrients that it's going to need in the spring when it shoots those up into the plant to form the leaves. It is a good strategy because during the winter you could have limbs broken off by ice storms, or you could have wind storms that would damage the plant. And if you've stored your energy in those parts of the plant, it's now lost. But anything that you've stored down in the roots in the ground, that should be retrievable, and the tree should be able to survive from that. So even if you've had significant damage to the tree, usually it can regrow from the energy stored in the root system. An extreme example of this would be this entire first row of trees next to the fence. My well-meaning wife one July came down and she decided to mow all of the tall grass, not realizing that I had planted a bunch of seedlings in it. I thought they were completely dead and gone, but the next year every one of them resprouted, and you can see now we've got all these healthy trees that are growing. So its ability to come back from the roots is pretty impressive. Another thing that I consider impressive about the roots, and it's kind of a thing that I find very interesting, is how various life forms have developed chemical weapons. You think of snakes developing poison. How did they evolve that? That's crazy. And you've got mosquitoes that evolved stuff that can be injected into your skin and draw the blood to it so they can suck that. You've got poison ivy. They grew a poison ivy, or grew a poison, the urushiol, to prevent animals from contacting it. The thing that the walnut has done, the species name is Juglans nigra, is it secretes a chemical that's known as juglone. And the juglone is kind of throughout the plant, but concentrated mostly in the roots. It secretes that, but it also seeps out into the soil around, and that will inhibit the growth of other species of trees and plants, and some of them it will even kill. And that juglone is very hard on things like tomatoes, so you don't want it growing near your garden. It's kind of interesting that it's effective against quite a few species of trees, and it will allow it to get all of the water and nutrients that other trees would be taking for itself. But it doesn't act against all tree species, so that selective use is a little bit surprising to me. And as a last important consideration, if you do woodworking with walnut, do not use the shavings as bedding for the horses. Horses will react very badly to walnut shavings. They'll get all sorts of problems with laminitis, swelling, running noses, heart palpitations. It's just really bad for the horses. Fortunately, once they're removed from the shavings, they can usually recover fairly quickly, but if they remain exposed for a few days, that can be very bad for them. So take care of these guys.